Hello, and welcome back to the panel. I am Ralph Lewis, and tonight, joining us from London is Mr. Mike Jarvis. Mr. Jarvis is a journalist and media researcher based in London and is a regular contributor to the Cayman Island Times newspaper. He's a former journalist at BBC World Service Caribbean Report and former director of communications and manager of Radio Montserrat. He also held senior editorial and management positions at the radio stations in the British Virgin Islands and Dutch St. Martin. Tonight, he'll be joining the conversation as we discuss the current invasion of Ukraine and the impact it will have on the overseas territories, including the Cayman Islands. During the second half of the program, we'll discuss the grey list and the good news that the Cayman Islands was not placed on it. I also wish to welcome my co-hosts, Mr. Roy Bodden and Mr. Mario Banks. Good night, gentlemen, and welcome now to the panel.
Good evening. Thank you.
Well, from my end, I'll have to say good morning. It's 1 a.m. in London. So, but for the Cayman Islands, good evening, everyone.
Yes. All right. And now let's get started. Mr. Jarvis, how far is Mr. Putin planning to go with this war?
That is the nuclear, quote unquote, question. It's very worrying, and the coverage that we're getting here in the UK and also from in the field in Ukraine and the neighboring islands. The big question is, what is Mr. Putin up to? Can he ever achieve his objectives? What are his objectives? How far does he plan to go to attain those objectives, particularly considering the threat that he made a few days ago in the form of a reminder, hello guys, I've got nuclear weapons, with the implication that I don't mind using them either. So it has a lot of people worried. The sanctions are beginning to bite. The big question is, how much of a difference will that make to Mr. Putin, given that he is, from my perspective, Mr. Putin, who at one point I was saying, okay, he's not a Gorbachev in a sense, but he seems to have a view of the world, of foreign policy, that he might be something the Western world and the rest of the world can do business with. But my personal worry now is that is Mr. Putin at this juncture any different from the gentleman Kim Il-jung in North Korea? It's quite concerning. It's quite worrying. And it seems as though his agenda is not to achieve what he had initially indicated. The concern that he stated that the NATO was expanding too much towards the east and too close to the Russian border, and the breakaway regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, which are mainly Russian-speaking, which he had recognized as independent states, which of course they are not. So if that's the case, then why not, quote unquote, secure those two regions? Why seemingly attempt to completely obliterate Ukraine? But Mr. Putin himself has stated, as far as he is concerned, Ukraine is not a real country and is part of the wider Russian/Soviet era empire federation that he's trying to recreate. The question to that is, well, if you destroy Ukraine just to get it, how are you going to rebuild it if your own economy is going to be destroyed? So I don't have answers to those, and everybody's just watching, waiting, negotiating, try to see if there's a way that this situation can be resolved. And yeah, I don't know if we are 1 minute to midnight, but yes, the clock is ticking.
Okay, well, let's hear what my co-hosts have to say. Mr. Roy, you want to jump in here, please, with your concerns?
Well, I understand that Putin has been a colonel in the KGB. So a colonel is a very high-ranking officer. I would assume that he would have had some kind of sense of history. Putin is doing what Napoleon and Hitler failed to do. That is to redraw the map of Europe. He won't be successful for the same reasons they were not successful. His supply lines are going to be drawn out. They're going to be subject to counterattacks. And now, even worse in his case, the rest of the world is slowly choking him off. He's going to be asphyxiating. And if you can imagine being choked to death, gentlemen, that is one of the worst forms of death you could ever experience. And that's what's going to happen to Putin. They're choking him to death. And it's true that he made the threat of nuclear weapons and intimated that he would use it. But again, that is what they call mutually assured destruction. He will destroy, but he himself will be destroyed. And therefore, what is his objective? Is he suicidal? Or does he have delusions of conquering the world and being another emperor of the whole world? He won't get through with it. He won't get through with it. And I am beginning now, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I'm beginning to question his mental state because he is showing signs of megalomania and is beginning to believe the spin that he is putting on the events, which is very dangerous for everyone involved.
Mr. Mario?
Yeah. First of all, I want to welcome Mike all the way from London, Mike Jarvis. I recognize his voice on BBC and also the Caribbean radio. So good to have you. Good to have you, Mike, with us tonight.
Thank you.
To your question, Ralph, in regard to the Putin war, Russia invasion of Ukraine, one of the things that I saw as this thing started to unveil, I said, we're coming to the end of COVID, which I thought was World War III. I thought it was a World War III against an invisible enemy. And I thought that we were going to be, back to some kind of eventual normalcy, a new normal perhaps. But as that is winding down, now this man has started a war in Europe that could extend, as Mike mentioned, it could really go well beyond Ukraine, hopefully not. But like you said, the sanctions are biting, as Roy mentioned, the sanctions are biting. Just the other day, as a matter of fact, on Friday, that came across my desk, a notice from the Monetary Authority of the Cayman Islands where a number of sanction notices have been put out. And one of them was no other than Vladimir Putin himself and his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. I saw that, I said, boy, this is really something, to have a president of a so-called first world country, and you have him sanctioned, that is really in the 21st century, in 2022. That's really, it was a very strange feeling that came over me. But what also came over me very strange in the last several days, looking at the television screen and seeing those young children and mothers traveling with their lives in their backpacks, and the children with little toys and teddy bears and stuff. It really struck me close to home, because in 1968, my family had to leave the Isle of Pines, Cuba, because of communism, to seek refuge as well. And so looking at those little boys and little girls and those women traveling through the cold and wet and dangerous conditions just because of one man, ego and power trip for no justifiable cause, is really, really, really sad. And I know history as well, and I know that all of you know that, and Dr. Roy is a historian, but we have to be careful with appeasement. I know that the NATO and the United States don't want to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. They're concerned about no-fly zone over Ukraine because they don't want to escalate this. But I wonder if we are just deferring the inevitable. And we have to be very careful with appeasement. We don't want to be warmongers and eagles that looking for unnecessary war, but we have to be careful with appeasement. And I am very concerned about this for the whole world. And the international response has been very unified, and the sanctions have been very, very tough. But this looking at the destruction taking place in civilian areas now, I wonder what his agenda is, and it's a really dark, dark day for the world.
And I hear you and I agree with you, Mr. Mario. It is indeed a dark day for the world. As we know, we live in a global village, and what happens across the world actually can affect home. And this is what we want to talk about now. How will it impact the Cayman Islands, the overseas territories, this region, and for how long? Because we're already feeling the impact. We mentioned that last week. The cost of living is already going high, and there's some nations who are suffering so much just from inflation. And now we have another war happening. We just saw where they attacked a nuclear plant in Ukraine, and it appears this is not going to end very soon. So, switching back to Mike, how do you think it will impact the Cayman Islands?
Well, it's inevitable that it's going to impact the Cayman Islands, the rest of the British overseas territories, the Caribbean, the Americas region, the entire world, and it is already happening. The COVID pandemic just turned the economies of the entire global economy upside down. Countries are currently struggling to come out of that. Some very cautiously. I think Cayman deserves some credit for taking the cautious step. Others, because the impact has been so hard on the economies, have taken the calculated risk of doing it a bit faster. But what we've had as a result of COVID already is high inflation, very, very high inflation. The supply lines have been disrupted. We're just in the process now of trying to get that entire global system back on track, looking at the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. But there's an old saying, the light at the end of the tunnel could be the oncoming train. We just didn't know that the oncoming train was going to be something like this. And it's already beginning to have, let's just focus on the economic effects just for starters. Oil prices are already shooting up, for starters. That is already affecting your fuel bills. It's already affecting the supply chain. It's already affecting the cost of goods in the stores. Well, the cost of goods generally. So expect to see, depending on how long this thing drags on for, a severe impact on energy bills, a severe impact on your imports cost, a severe impact with inflation. It could also have a deleterious impact on immigration, because people will start moving again if things, even not in the immediate war zone, if things which are already bad in their countries because of COVID and perhaps other situations as well, then you add this present crisis that is creating, or well, has the potential and is already starting to create further hardship. You're already going to have a massive movement of people, and we are already seeing that happening across the border that Ukraine shares with some other countries. So let's filter this down to the British overseas territories, which are generally import-based economies that rely on tourism largely, and the offshore financial sector, or financial sector in one form or the other. The sanctions that are being slapped, there's a big debate now that's kicking off in the UK about how do we manage the sanctions? How much pain are we prepared to bear as a result of the very same sanctions that are being placed on Russia? The European Union has taken some very, very strong measures, the UK and several other countries as well. But the countries that are not necessarily countries that have a manufacturing base, well, even if they have a manufacturing base, the cost of the energy that it takes to run the manufacturing base is going to be affected. A lot of these Russian oligarchs and businesses that are being pressurized because, and rightly so, because of their close links to Putin, are now trying to find ways of getting their money out of the areas where they're being penalized into other friendly jurisdictions. So if your economy is based on the offshore financial sector, you're not immune. You're going to get a hit as well. And your import are going to get a hit as well. So the cost of those right across the board, the cost of living is going to be affected. And so coming out of the belt tightening, the COVID-induced belt tightening, we are now likely to have another round of belt tightening that is I would want to call it the Putin-induced belt tightening. And let's not forget, we're talking about the price of oil. Russia is the second largest oil producer in the world. Mr. Putin has that in his armory as well. Russia is the largest producer of gas in the world. Mr. Putin has that in his armor as well. So he's prepared to play, and he's playing a very, very, very dangerous cat and mouse game. And when you add I know Dr. Borden spoke to it if he's mad enough to do it, but all it takes is one nuclear weapon. And I do not put it beyond Mr. Putin that he will fire one of those things just to maybe not hit a particular country or particular city, but just to demonstrate, drop it in the sea close to a country. Hello, guys, I have this weapon too. But before he goes to that nuclear option, let us see what's happening with the oil and gas prices, because that's going to have a knock-on effect down the line. And the OPEC countries have indicated that at this juncture, they are not prepared to increase their production. So let's see where this goes.
Mr. Borden?
Well, everything that Mike has said is spot on. What I want to do now is focus more acutely on how those geopolitics will affect jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands, whose economy is primarily based upon tourism and international finance. Both of these sectors are going to be hit, and hit hard, just at a time, as Mike said, we were straining to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The mere fact that fuel prices are going to rise puts travel at a premium, even cruise tourism, not to mention stayover people who come by planes. So that is going to have a snowballing effect. Food prices, hotel rooms, airline tickets, or cabins on cruise ships, bang, that's a big hit. Then when you couple that with the chokehold on the finances, because let us face facts, I'm not an expert at these things, but every book I read, and I've just completed reading Moneyland, every book I read, and no one will be able to convince me that the overseas territories are not the beneficiary of some of that Russian oligarch money in London. If I were a wagering man, I would wager my wallet on a Friday night that some of that money is around in the overseas territories. And so by inference, some of it will eventually reach the Cayman Islands if it has not reached. Now, when that is choked off, that's going to affect a lot of people, a lot of attorneys, a lot of accountants, a lot of people who manage these businesses for these people already. I was watching in the news, I see a yacht registered in the Cayman Islands owned by a Russian oligarch has been seized on the French Riviera. That is one. They are going after others. So eventually, if this conflict drags on, it is going to seriously, if not detrimentally, affect our economy here. I mean, our premier has intimated that we are going to feel some effects. So I think it would be wise for us to keep one eye on the geopolitics as well as one eye on the local scene.
Thank you, Mr. Mario.
Yeah, I want to go back to the oil production issue just very briefly. And I think some of the suggestions has been that the United States ought to begin or increase its production as well. I mean, there's been this administration in particular, because of valid environmental concerns, have chosen to import rather than produce and refine its own resources in the United States and North America in general, Canada. Also, Guyana has recently found a tremendous source of oil as well, and they're already starting to they have extraction facilities already, and they're doing it. So, I mean, I think that's another thing to look at is bringing some of that production back to the West, and so reduce the dependence on the Middle East and Russia. Of course, solar power as well, solar energy. I think I saw something today where Caribbean Utilities Company, CUC, has announced that they're going to be doing 5 new solar solar fields, which again is good, but of course that's a couple of years away. But going back to the financial services industry and the impact that Mike and Dr. Roy mentioned, I think we're going to see some increased pressure on the financial industry, due diligence, know your customer, especially in the area of anti-money laundering as a result of this, because you're right. I mean, there certainly is a very good chance that money and assets are somehow within our jurisdiction and within certain vehicles and companies and whatnot, that it's hard to get to. Of course, the other thing that has been around for a couple of years is this beneficial ownership register, where the Cayman Islands and others are being pressured to have a open register. And as you all know, our position as a country has been that, and the EU and the UK in particular are pressuring us to that. Our position has been for years that if it is a globally recognized standard, and if other countries are doing it, and it's a level playing field, certainly we'll do it. But I think we have until 2024 or 2025 to have a register. So I think we're going to probably see some direct economic impact from this in the financial industry, but we're going to see, I think, more red tape, due diligence, know your customer pressures as well. But I think that as part of our business continuity and disaster recovery from this crisis that just started now with this war and the impact on our financial industry, is for us to look at Cayman intensifying its PR and communications around the world in terms of the benefits of the Cayman Islands as a offshore financial services center, not as a place for money laundering or for place as a haven for ill-gotten gains, but for legitimate business. And that's where we need to continue to sell ourselves and to go out there and talk about the benefits of places like the Cayman Islands to global commerce. So I hope that we'll be able to talk a bit more about that. But I think that I'm hoping that the financial industry, the Cayman Finance, the Ministry of Financial Services are thinking about how we can actually get into a defensive position to protect our industry in the scope of this impending tsunami of economic and regulatory pressures.
And you make some
Um,
very good points there. I think that we'll probably talk about it further in the second half. We just have a few things I want to mention. And the panel is here for serious conversation. And everything we say might not be what people want to hear, but I believe in reality. And I'm very concerned on a number of fronts. Number one, our major industry is finance. Our second industry is tourism. Tourism has been tanked. It's now trying to come back, but it's going to be impacted, as we mentioned, by this crisis. So we're having crisis after crisis. We've called it the perfect storm. We hope we don't have a hurricane this year, but it appears that we are going through all these crises, and we've been telling people, tighten your belts, tighten your belts. Now, my belt buckle's on the last hole. I don't have much more to tighten at this stage. And so, we have to find some solutions as how we're going to make it happen, because we have a lot of people who are having mental issues. We just can't deal with any more crises at this stage. So we want to talk about some solutions. How do we get through this and help people to understand, yes, it's serious, but there has to be some way out. The next question we're going to ask is, how do we end the war, and how do we help people to get through the war? Right?
well, Ralph, if I had the answers on how to end the situation, I probably would be the Prime Minister of Britain or the ambassador to the EU or something. It is a tough one. And just a slight segue, but to go back to where we were, and I'll come back to the issue you raised, Ralph, if I can.
Yes.
London. In terms of the impact that this whole scenario is already having and is further likely to have on the overseas territories. The sanctions that are now being applied in the overseas territories are sanctions that have been, I don't want to say dictated, because we're all part of sitting in the same ship as overseas territories of the UK, but these are sanctions that are handed down, that are imposed by the British government, that the overseas territories are obligated to implement as well. And particularly so because in practically all, to one degree or another, the overseas territories are involved in the financial services sector. There's been a lot of pressure on Cayman, Bermuda, etc., on how the sector operates. And there's been quite a lot of pushback, because some of that pressure, some people, would suggest, is probably based on envy, because the financial sector has made as the standard of living in the overseas territories comparatively and to a degree quite high compared to other larger countries. Where the issue, I think, dovetails that we need to pay attention to is the big debate that is happening in London at the moment, because a lot of the focus is on regulation and due diligence. It's not only the sanctions that are flowing down to the overseas territories or across to the overseas territories from the UK, which is the proper thing to do at the moment. A lot of the problems that we're having, particularly with the Russian oligarchs, and I'll hasten to say, not all Russians, all wealthy Russians are oligarchs or are dodgy dealers, but a lot of the funds that have been, quote unquote, parked, or investment funds in the overseas territories, have to one degree or another come via London. And London, the UK itself, is having a massive debate over how it manages its own world-leading financial center, the financial district that is called the Square Mile. And the Russian investments in the UK, particularly in London, where the beneficial ownership issue is now topping the agenda. Who owns these multi-million-dollar properties? And the effort now is to trace the money, find the paper trail or the digital trail or whatever. And in a lot of instances, it's leading back to places like Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, sorry Cayman, but the Cayman Islands, to a lesser degree, I understand, Anguilla as well, London, Luxembourg, etc. So we are all caught up in this thing together, and it is a fight that, we all have to, fight this battle together. there's another issue that when Ralph spoke about how we defeat Mr. Putin or get out of the situation, Germany has done something this past week that no one thought Germany would have done, and Germany itself had pledged not to do. Export military assistance. Germany has sent military aid to Ukraine.
Yes.
After the situation with the Second World War, and Germans are still trying to, distance themselves from that, Germany has been dragged back into this. But this is the same Germany that depends on Russia for 40% of its energy supplies. Just consider that for a moment. Germany and Italy. So Mr. Putin he has these, I don't want to say Trump card because it probably, might have other suggestions or implications therein. But Mr. Putin is not a foolish man. I think he's a devious, very dangerous, and probably at this juncture, maybe everything is not 100% upstairs megalomaniac tendencies being displayed, but he knows what he has. So he can tighten the screws on Germany. Germany is fighting back in its own way, but who is going to fill the void so that Germany, which is the leading economy in the EU, gets its energy supplies? Because it has a knock-on effect. Germany is heavily invested in the UK. So if Germany gets hit, and if to a lesser degree Italy gets hit, it impacts the UK economy. And given the links with the offshore financial sector industry between London and the offshore territories, particularly in this case Cayman, it's going to have a knock-on effect there as well. So I don't have the answer, but in order to get to the answers, it's important that we identify where the challenges are. So I don't know if Dr. Bodden or Mr. Ebanks might have some answers for me, because I need some help here.
Well, I think I'll jump ahead unless Dr. Roy, you want to jump in, or I won't.
No, you go ahead, Mario.
Okay, I think the question Ralph asked about how to stop this war. I mean, there's different options, but I think I'm hoping and praying that some citizen or citizens in Russia itself, whether they're oligarchs or whether they're common citizens or whether it's his own inner circle, including security, will realize that they're starting to suffer so much that they will do the right thing. Because I believe that it's going to have to take, I mean, that's what happened to Hitler. Hitler committed suicide, but there was also other stories again about what happened in his bunker. But I think that the people are being pressured. And what happens in a lot of these cases is the big guys are not really, they're incubated, insulated from the hardship. It's common citizens. But these people have families as well. And I think that if somebody or bodies get together within Russia, and they're very bold and courageous too, they're protesting and getting arrested by the thousands each day. But I think the tide is starting to rise there too with protests. But what got me is, how can a former president of the United States characterize Mr. Putin as being a genius? How much of a genius you can be if you destroy your own economy to go after another country that is your neighbor. You're going to destroy that country and then want to occupy and run it. I mean, is that a genius? I think it's another word for that kind of behavior. But Mr. Putin reminds me a lot of the kind of behavior of Adolf Hitler with the propaganda. I mean, he talks about he wants to denazify Ukraine. Now, the Ukraine president, Zelensky, apparently is a Jew himself. He's a Jew. So how can you denazify a country that's run by a Jew and also have democratic standards and free elections? And he talked about demilitarizing it. So I don't know, Ralph. I think people are going to have to deal with this. If the United States and NATO are not prepared to take the military route and deal with it, the people are going to have to deal with it, but they're going to suffer quite a bit in the meantime. And I also think that it's time to assemble the war crimes tribunals, because just as there were the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II, and there was the tribunals that took place in The Hague after the Bosnia-Serbia war that caused people like Milosevic and others to end up imprisoned and whatnot for that war. Mr. Putin and some of his top circle should face war crimes tribunal and also be subjected to justice as a result of that, sooner or later.
Thank you, Mario. Mr. Bond.
You know, I listened carefully to what Mike was saying, and his concerns are my concerns with regard to how are the overseas territories going to fare. And everybody knows my position. I argue that for years, we in the Cayman Islands have been measuring our progress on a Falter report card. That's the old school teacher in me. Because my logic is this: if your livelihood comes from counting money, which is not your own money, then pray tell me, what are you going to do when the owners of that money come for it? What are you going to count then? And so, while I would hope not, it seems to me that this conflict is going to hasten our demise in that regard. Gentlemen, one of the things I believe after this is over, the whole international order will be changed. I put it to you this: if the Western powers and NATO wins this, the United States is going to ensure that the United States has a greater grip and a greater influence on the world economy. They have been aspiring to get in this position for years. And now they have a wonderful opportunity to once again be the world's policeman. Putin, although he was determined not to let that happen and for it to be a bipolar world, he has just gifted the United States. Because let me tell you something, China is a paper tiger. The United States controls the gold and the money flow, and the dollar is king, and they will set the terms of the world's economy. Mark my words.
Interesting.
Can I just come back on, well, not
Right.
come back, but just expand on a few points that were raised there? Propaganda. If I could put that in bold and underline it. Mr. Putin made, and I wonder why did he do it today? You're 8 days into a war that you initiated. You threw your military might at Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting back very, very, very valiantly. You have this massive military industrial complex that is at your disposal, and your nuclear weapons and your oil and your gas and your oligarchs and all that wealth. Why was it necessary for Mr. Putin to come today and really, if I'm to go in my West Indian mode, just chat a whole lot of rubbish that the Ukrainians are committing genocide and trying to revisit or restate this issue about NATO expansion, and he's trying to secure the homeland, and there are no atrocities being committed, when we are seeing everything being played out before our very eyes? You see, what we're finding out that in Russia, and they're busy now shutting down any element of independent media.
Mm-hmm.
So already in Russia, it would appear that over 70% of the people rely on the state media to dispel or disseminate a singular point of view that praises the fatherland, that claims the fatherland is the one that's under threat, that the Ukrainians I don't know how they figure that one out, are the ones who are, and the West are causing the cause of the conflict, etc., etc., etc. But that old style propaganda ended in the dark period of the Cold War and the 60s, and even even before World War II. It no longer works because this is the digital age. Newspapers still have a very important part to play, but more importantly, everybody seems to be able to have a video camera up someplace, on some building, in some tree, in some garage, someplace. You can, on my TV, because of the nature of my work, sometimes I have the TV on and I'm looking about 8, 10, 15 video feeds. And what is happening now, they are conglomerating all of these video feeds. So you're looking at about 50 different video feeds there, and we can all see what's going on. But so the propaganda war, as far as the West is concerned, is being lost. And Mr. Putin realizes that. That is why he was speaking. He came out and made that speech today. But he wasn't talking to convince anybody in Ukraine or anybody in the West. He was preaching to the converted, sending that message to his own people. And that's the danger with old style propaganda. So somehow Mr. Navalny, the opposition leader that he has imprisoned, has been able to get messages out, telling people to continue to protesting. The young people now are getting the word out as to what's really happening on the ground. Russian soldiers are being captured and are being given phones by Ukrainians telling them, call home and tell your parents where you are. Because apparently a lot of these soldiers, Mr. Putin, by the way, in Russia, you are not apparently allowed to use the term war. It is a military operation or something of that sort. But the word is gradually filtering back to Russia as to what exactly is going on. Now, as this materializes, it's going to make Mr. Putin feel like a cornered rat. And he gave an analogy that in a previous interview, and it's being replayed now, he had an encounter with this rat. And he said, learn from the rat. He had the rat cornered, but the rat kept coming back at him, at his head. That's how Mr. Putin. So Mr. Putin now is saying, okay, I'm a cornered rat. Now I'm going to fight back. Now, what do I have in my arsenal? Not only nuclear weapons and something I heard today, thermobaric weapons that suck all the oxygen and inflame everything or something like that. So he doesn't need nuclear weapons. He has those things. And they are on the battlefield, by the way. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So he has those. He has his oil. He has the gas. And he's prepared to use those as leverage. Dr. Bowden, sorry if I'm a bit lengthy, but just want to make this point. You mentioned China. China is going to be very, very crucial in how this is resolved. And Mr. Ebanks, you said no appeasement. There's a term being tossed around now. Listen, somebody like Putin, you've got to give him a golden bridge. It can't be 100% win-win, but you've got to give him something, because he is emboldened. Now, China has to step up to the plate. By the way, Mr. Putin has more nuclear weapons, far more nuclear weapons than China that is next door to him. He has the most nuclear weapons in the world, I think 5,900 to the United States, 5,500. I think the next down has about 300 and something, the UK. So that is the situation that we're in at the moment. So he has to be given something, but the issue is, what does he want? I don't think he only wants Ukraine, because he takes Ukraine, he takes Latvia, he goes back after all of those Warsaw Pact countries, and something tells me that is where Mr. Putin is headed. So we might be into this for the long haul, and the way he's trying to obliterate Ukraine, it is absolutely shocking and disheartening. Appeasement, no, but well, maybe the guy who says he knows the art of the deal, does he have a role to play? I doubt it very much, but this is where we are.
You don't have that.
Well,
Genius, it's genius.
well, gentlemen, it's a very interesting topic, and it's like I'm watching a movie. You know, this is only part one, and hopefully we don't have many more parts to follow after this. But just one thing I would like to mention, and to touch on Mr. Budden, Dr. Budden's comment regarding America wanting to build that economic power. I remember in my banking years attending a training center in the U.S. and on the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was put in place after 9/11, and that was when pressure started coming on the of the offshore centers, financial centers, to tighten up on how they do business with their clients, how to record who the beneficial owners are, who the beneficiaries are, and that's where the funds are coming from. And that's when that change in direction for America when they had the first terrorist attack on their homeland is when things started to heat up and put a lot of pressure on the financial centers. And I've seen many banks here who actually had to pay fines based on certain actions. Now, what we're going to see, and like you said, is another tightening up of those conditions, because you know there's lists, and we're going to talk about the gray list in a minute, but there's the FATF, and there are other lists from other countries that are going to be re-examined. And I think that we're going to see some pressure on those to try and see, okay, well, you know what? These guys, they have the money all over the place. They're enjoying certain luxuries, and they're friends with these people who want to who want to invade territories. So they're going to use this opportunity to introduce other pressures on other territories, not only Ukraine. And this is my concern. So just to say, as we segue into the last topic for tonight, is the Cayman Islands was left off of the gray list. And Mario, maybe you can speak to that. Do you see it as a very good thing for Cayman?
Yeah. Let me just say one last thing on the other topic before that. I think solar power for Cayman is something we got to look at to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We also got to have a look at our land use. I mean, I drive often from West Bay to North Side, and I pass that beautiful land in the Midlands in Mr. Roy's districts, where you see such beautiful farmland that's being cleared with beautiful red and black soil being taken away and replaced by marl for residential developments. What are we doing about our farming and about food security? And the last thing I want to say, we have no national development plan for the country. So whenever we have a crisis, we are left kind of like, flip-flopping. So I'll leave that there. And to go back to your question about the gray list, I think it's good that Cayman has been removed from the gray list. I know that there's going to be another list that we're going to be on sometime in March, sometime this month. But I want to commend the private sector stakeholders, the government, decision makers and regulators from the Ministry of Financial Services and all the other players for working so hard to get us off the gray list. But Ralph, the thing that gets me is that the Cayman Islands has actually been leading the way for years in terms of financial best practices. We probably have 150 maybe what we call tax information exchange agreements, TIAs. We have been compliant with FATF and the CFATF. We have this commitment to the beneficial ownership register, as long as it's a global standard and everybody else is playing as well as a level playing field. We've complied and over-complied with the OECD and EU conventions, agreements, and protocols. The FATCA compliance. I mean, we have done a lot, and so we ought to be off the gray list. But again, sometimes it's a case of might over right, and as a small country, we always have to be on the defensive and the goalposts keep on being changed. But I think it's a good thing that we're off the list. We need to keep it that way. But as I mentioned, we have to increase our communication, our PR, our lobbying to make sure that Cayman's message about our positive attributes are always out in the forefront of the marketplace.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Roy?
Well, the business that the Cayman Islands have chosen to be in is a business which demands being on the cutting edge, being alert, being competitive. So far, we have done well, and I hope that we continue to do well. But I see, as we advance, the centrifugal pressures to bear upon us. And another important thing we have to take into consideration is that every little jurisdiction wants to get in the business that we are in, tourism and international finance. So apart from living up to the expectations and the regulations we have from the OECD, from the FATF, from the CFATF, and all these other organizations, we also have to keep an eye on our fellow competitors, which are often our brothers and sisters in the overseas territory. And I have said from day one, and everybody knows my position, I am not comfortable with us trying to build a society on something as fickle as tourism and banking. I just think that one of these days we are going to be in for a big surprise. The money is not ours, and we have no control over international geopolitics. So it would be good, while we have time, to be seeking to diversify, to strengthen our economy by growing internal mechanisms. But that's a wasted exercise. And nobody listens to that kind of talk because it's not popular. It won't win elections because it means that we have to plan beyond the next 4 years. And nobody wants to do that. I look at the next generation, not the next election.
Thank you, Dr. Budden. Mr. Mike.
Yes. I think Mario was indicating.
I was just going to add to Dr. Roy's point about diversifying. And I remember when you were elected in 1984, Dr. Roy, and the government at that time, Mr. Norman Borden was the Minister for Tourism, Aviation, and Trade. And you all did something called there was a diversification study done, and they did something called the Buy Caymanian campaign. And it was a diversification strategy around light manufacturing and agriculture and whatnot. But it just, as everything else, collected dust, and we're still no further ahead. So we need to have a plan, but we need to have people who are going to carry it out, regardless of political leanings. I give way to you, Mike.
Yes, okay, thank you. When I came across the information that that the decision was actually made on February 24th, but it just seems to be coming out now. I was happy. I was happy for the Cayman Islands, and not so happy that there are other overseas territories that are still on the gray list. But I think there's a linkage, and I'll try to be brief with this. I think there's a linkage at this juncture with what is happening with the Russia-Ukraine situation and the offshore financial services sector. Because my point of view is that there's enough expertise that's been accumulated over the years in places like the Cayman Islands and Bermuda, BVI, etc., Gibraltar, that can actually influence how we move forward with the management of the offshore financial centers, for the only reason that the sanctions that are being applied on Russia the Russian state, the Russian oligarchs, the Russian political leadership are filtering right down to the overseas territories because of the involvement in the or how the financial services sector is being used and probably misused. Well, misused obviously because that's why there are sanctions. So Dr. Roy spoke about a changing international order. I'm of the view that this entire situation will change the global international order, not only politically, but also economically. It is going to force a rethink. I think the Cayman Islands in particular is in a very, very strong position to influence how we go forward in terms of the global management of tax jurisdictions. The Cayman Islands has to be heard, has to make a very, very strong input in whatever is decided going forward in this, and not just to be sitting down on the back benches being told what to do. I think Cayman has to be in a very strong position up front to influence what to do, because in the situation of the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, other overseas territories, whose economies are doing a lot better than many of the other, practically all of the other Caribbean countries, a standard of living, a way of life has been created. It's very difficult to tell people, well, we've got to step back from that. They will have to step back, because remember the days when in the 70s, when we had the oil crisis. What was call it propaganda if you will, but what was the key slogan? Grow local, buy local.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Grow it, what's it? Grow what you eat and eat what you grow.
Mm-hmm.
But as the years have rolled on and we've settled back into some sort of a comfort, and I'm saying I'm a West Indian, okay, right?
Yeah.
We've settled back into some sort of a comfort zone. We are a lot happier to import what we need, or to actually go overseas and purchase stuff that we can produce in our countries. But bear in mind, a lot of the stuff that we're going to some of these metropolitan, whether it be, say, Miami or New York or London for whatever reasons, Puerto Rico, etc. But we're going there to buy stuff that they're importing from other countries, particularly from Latin America. Yeah. So I think, we are on the cusp of a massive rethink, massive global political rethink. I think some boundaries are going to be redrawn, but also a massive rethink in terms of how we manage and reinforce and Putin-proof our economies going forward. And I think Cayman has a role to play in that, and the other overseas territories as well, particularly those with financial centers.
Yeah.
That's how I think about it.
What I will say, that the panel has its work cut out for it. I think that we will be here for some time, because as the crises develop, there needs to be a serious source that people can tune into and listen to intelligent conversations that that people can relate to, and without fear of talking about these issues and having them recorded. And so, I really appreciate the opportunity to sit with you gentlemen. I think we can go on for 2-3 hours, but I'm trying to stay within my...
It's 2 o'clock in the morning in London, boss.
Oh, yes. Mike has to go back to sleep. And, but also, I'm keeping in line with my 1 hour limit. As you know, in about 2 weeks, we should be on radio. So we have to get into that mode where we have a 1 hour program. We just let people know that we're getting ready to be on radio. And we want to thank Mike for waking up or staying awake and being on with us. And we really appreciate it. The information is invaluable, and we really learned quite a bit. Gentlemen, my co-hosts, Mr. Mario and Mr. Roy, thank you for joining me again. And for all those viewers and listeners, thank you for your support. And you'll be seeing great things happen here at the panel as we monitor what happens not only in the Cayman Islands, but around the world. Thank you, and have a good evening, and see you next week, Thursday, same time, same place. Good night.
Thanks for having me, and good morning.
It was my pleasure, Mike. It was my pleasure to appear on the show with you, Mike.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Be safe.